The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I'm the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Bridging Research and Policy, Insights from American Association for the Advancement of Science Congressional Fellows. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them. Today's webinar is being recorded. After it ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel, and I will share that link with all registrants. Please feel free to share the link widely. And now I would like to turn things over to Dr. Elizabeth Day to introduce today's topic and speakers.
Great, thank you, Patricia. As she said, my name is Elizabeth Day, and I am currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research at Cornell University, and I am very excited to be the moderator for our panel of awesome speakers today. For our presentation, Bridging Research and Policy, Insights from the American Association for the Advancement of Science Congressional Fellows. Today, I'll start with just a brief introduction of each of our speakers, and then we'll jump right into our content. We're going to start pretty specifically talking about individuals themselves, so how to work successfully to engage with policymakers themselves. And when we say policymakers, we're focusing mostly today on legislators, although a lot of the tips would work for working with agency officials as well. Then we'll start with individuals themselves, and then we'll broaden the scope a bit to understand the institutions within which they work. So talking about the differences between the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, as well as the legislative process and the role of committees. And then we'll end with some general challenges and benefits to bridging research and policy, and talk more about the uses of research throughout the policy process. And then we are happy to answer some questions at the end of our presentation today. Our speakers today are a fantastic group of women, and I don't just say that because they are my friends. First, Rashmi, who's the Internationalization Committee member for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, will start us off. Rashmi she had a dual position as a fellow. She was in Congressman Grijalva's office, and she also worked for the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Catherine Palucci, who is an associate professor of mathematics education at SUNY New Paltz. She was a fellow, an education fellow for Senator Al Franken, and now she is a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the NSF. Emily Douglas was a fellow working for the Senate Finance Committee and Senator Ron Wyden, and she is currently professor and department head in social science and policy studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And then, as I said, I'm Elizabeth Day. I'm a postdoc at Cornell, and I was a fellow with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. So I am going to pass things over to Rashmi, and she's going to start us off.
Hi everyone, thanks Elizabeth for the introduction. I will be presenting on the first two topics, which are how to successfully engage policymakers, and then I will discuss some major differences between the House and the Senate to understand the context in which these policy members operate. Next slide, please. Now, imagine you're concerned about a particular issue and you want to communicate research on this topic to a policymaker. Amongst the first thing you want to do to communicate effectively to a policymaker is to get a sense of whether the issue that you're concerned about is more of a federal level issue or whether it's more of a state level issue. I have given a picture here that can give you a sense of some of the powers that are given to the federal government and those that are given to the state government. Now, for instance, let's say you're concerned about the situation in Yemen and the possible involvement of the United States in the war crimes that may be going on there. That would be more of a federal government issue. But if you're concerned about, let's say, the schools in your neighborhood, that would be more of a state government issue. In that case, it would be better for you to get in touch with your state level policymakers. Having said that, there are some shared powers that they hold, and at the same time, there can be a great overlap in the topics that they're concerned with. Next slide, please. Now, I worked at the US Congress, so for the rest of the presentation, I will be focusing on the legislative branch of the federal government. Let's say you figured out the topic that you want to communicate about, that it's a federal level issue. One of the first things you want to find out is who your representatives are and that you've got their names correctly, the pronunciation of their names correctly. To find out more about who your legislators are, there's a website called govtrack.us, and I'll keep referring to this website through my presentation. So you can go here and you can see there's a screenshot that I've given here at the bottom of GovTrack. And on the left-hand side bottom of left-hand side corner of the website, you can see there's a place where you can enter your address. So when you enter your address there, they'll tell you who your representative is and who your senators are for your state. With respect to the pronunciation, there are a few ways to figure that out. One, you can watch interviews on television with these members of Congress, and you can see how the interviewers are introducing them. The other thing you can do is call their officers and listen to how the staffers are introducing them. Oftentimes, when you call the office, they would pick up the phone and they would say something like, "Good morning, Congressman Grijalva's office. How can I help you?" So that's one way of figuring that out. And if for some reason you didn't catch that, it's perfectly okay to ask the staffer, "Hey, I would have liked to connect with a member of Congress. Could you please help me with the pronunciation of their name first?" Next slide, please. Next thing you want to do is you want to find out a little bit more about your legislator and what their priorities are. And there are a few ways to learn more about this. The first thing you can do is check out their committee pages. On each of their websites, you will find that there would be a committee page tab, and you can go there and find out what are the committees that they have been assigned to. So I've given an example here. The first page that you see here, that's an example from Congressman Grijalva's committee page, and it tells you which are the different committees that he's on. The second thing you can do to figure out about their priorities is to check out their issues page. Most members of Congress have an issues page on their website, but some of them don't. And what the issues page tells you is some of the main issues that they are concerned about. And the last thing you can do is refer to their press releases page. That should also give you a sense of the priorities that they have and the issues that they're concerned about. Next slide, please. You also want to know what are some of the legislations that your members of Congress have worked on in the past or are working on currently, and their voting record on these issues. Now, how do you find these out? To figure out more about the legislations that they worked on in the past or what they are focusing on right now, once again, GovTrack is a really good resource for that. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's a screenshot that I've taken from GovTrack, and this is of Congressman Grijalva, and it shows you some of the legislations that have been enacted, which means these are the legislations that he's worked on in the past, and some of the bills that he has sponsored, meaning these are legislations that are being considered right now that he has sponsored, that he has supported. So that's one way to figure out what are the legislations that they're working on. In terms of the voting record, there are two ways to do this. GovTrack gives you a sense of the voting records, and there's another website called ontheissues.org, And the screenshot below is from ontheissues.org. And so what they do is they basically address different topics and show you how the member of Congress has tended to vote on these issues. So here, for instance, it's Congressman Raul Grijalva on budget and economy, and it shows you how he voted on these different bills that had come up. Next slide, please. Now, once you know a bit about the legislator, you are ready to connect with the office. When you call the office, and the number is available on their website, so when you call the office, most likely an intern will answer the phone. However, if you're calling the house, any of the offices on the house side, it is possible that absolutely anybody could be picking up the phone. And that happens because house offices are typically understaffed. So anybody from an intern to the legislative director can pick up the phone. So you want to make sure that you're really polite and respectful when you speak to them. And you can ask them to connect you to the right staffer. So for example, you can say, hi, I'm calling from your constituency. I would like to speak to a staffer who works on gun legislations or who works on mental health issues, for instance. And at this point, either they're going to transfer your call to the concerned staffer if they are around, but many a times what happens is staffers run an incredibly busy schedule and they are oftentimes out of the office. So when that happens, they are going to either give you the email address, and if by any chance they don't, feel free to ask them. They easily give that away. Now, either at this point, you're either connected to them over the phone or you're about to connect to them over the email, or even better, you may have gotten an appointment with a member of Congress. So how do you communicate with the staffer or the member at this point? First thing I would say is do your research on the issue. Know what some of the major debates are in your area so that if that comes up during the conversation, you should know how to handle that. Secondly, what you want to keep in mind is you want to educate and not moralize. And this is particularly true if the member, by any chance, does not hold the same position as you on a given topic. Thirdly, what I would say is to make the conversation more impactful, explain the implications of your research for their particular state or for their particular district. And finally, I would say when you speak to them, take one or two very clear asks. For example, I would like you to vote yes or no on a certain bill. Or you could say there's a certain area which has been completely neglected. There's absolutely no legislation on it. I would really appreciate it if you would consider proposing a bill on this. Next slide, please. Now, typically, you would be able to connect with multiple members and their offices because you have members both in the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. So in the following discussion, I want to talk to you a bit about the differences between the House and the Senate to give you a better sense of the context in which these policymakers are operating. Next slide, please. So amongst the first differences between the House and the Senate is that the Senate is composed of 100 members of Congress, while the House is composed of 435 members. Now, this is because the purpose of the House and the Senate are somewhat different. The Senate was designed to give equal representation to each state. So the Senate is composed of 2 senators from each of the states. There are 50 states multiplied by 2 senators each, and that comes up to 100. When it comes to the House, each US state is represented in the House in proportion to its population, but it's entitled to at least 1 representative. So the purpose of the House, in a way, is to sort of represent the districts, the congressional districts that fall within a state. There are some states that are extremely populous, like California, and from there we have 53 representatives in the House, but there are others that are sparsely populated, like Alaska, Delaware, and Wyoming. And each of these districts have 1 representative each from these states. A second difference is that senators serve 6-year terms, and the terms are staggered so that approximately 1/3 of the seats are up for election every 2 years. Members in the House of Representatives, on the other hand, they serve 2-year terms. So every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-elections, and these elections are held in every even-numbered year. A third difference between the House and the Senate is that is in terms of staffing. Each Senate office will have a much larger staff as compared to the House. And what that means is, for example, they will have one staffer who's handling immigration or one staffer who's handling issues of health. On the other hand, when it comes to the House, they have a much smaller staff. They are constantly understaffed. So what that means is oftentimes the same staff is handling multiple issues. They have multiple issues on their portfolio. But what that means for you as a constituent is that you have lesser relationship building to do probably on the House side. It's possible, let's say, if you're working on something like issues of minority mental health, it's entirely possible that the staffer who's dealing with Native American rights issues is also dealing with the rights of African American people, is also dealing with the rights of women, and it's also dealing with immigration issues. So in that case, you can talk to the same staffer about the issues that you're concerned about, as opposed to building individual relationships as you will have to on the Senate side. And a final difference between the House and the Senate is that there are some very specific powers that both of these chambers are granted. For example, the Senate has the power to consent to treaties with foreign countries before ratification. They also have the power to confirm appointments of cabinet secretaries, federal judges, and other federal executives. The House, on the other hand, some of the powers that are specific to them are that all impeachment proceedings must begin in the House of Representatives. Similarly, if during the presidential elections, in case there is an electoral college tie, it's the House that gets to decide who will be the president. Yet, despite these differences, there is overwhelming similarity in terms of the issues the House and the Senate handle. And this is also quite evident in the committees within the House and the Senate, where you'll find several parallels. And committees is exactly what Catherine will be talking to you about. I am happy to take questions at the end of all of the presentation. For now, it's over to Catherine.
Great, thank you, Rashmi. So we're going to move on to talk a little bit about the legislative process and the role that committees play within this process. Can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the image that you see in front of you is actually quite a complex one. We certainly aren't going to spend enough time on it at the moment for you to take in everything that's in here, but you will have an opportunity to access this later on and spend a little bit more time with it. But I will point to a few key things in particular that lead into what I'm about to discuss with regard to the role of committees. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that this is the process that takes place within the House of Representatives, whereas from about where it turns from red to pinkish purple begins with the process for the legislative process for the Senate. And in each of these cases, you'll notice that after the green space on the House side and the dark red little sliver on the Senate side that says introducing legislation, there is a large chunk of this process that says committee work. And this is why we've chosen to spend a little extra time during this webinar talking specifically about committees and how to position your conversations with legislators with regard to committees and this legislative process. Thank you. Next slide. So I want to start with something that will also help to navigate the legislative process that is a little bit more interactive, and it's the Congress.gov website. Anyone can go to this, and it's a great place for you to be able to explore legislation that might be out there in certain issues, the status of a piece of legislation that you might be interested in, and so on. When you go to Congress.gov, this is the main site that you'll see, and I want to direct your attention to the top part where you go to advanced searches. And we're going to click there, and we'll see on the next slide what that looks like. All right, so when you click on advanced searches, you'll see a whole bunch more options that come up for you. And the first thing I'll point your attention to is which Congress you want to look in. So the current Congress will always be at the top, but it's important to know that if a piece of legislation doesn't get passed, doesn't get turned into law during a particular Congress, then at the end of each Congress, which is each 2-year period, everything gets wiped clean. So all legislation that was introduced previously has to be reintroduced into the next Congress. So if it's early in a Congress, you may have to look back at a previous Congress, or if you're trying to track something current, you'd want to stay right within whatever the most recent Congress is. But you can see I've checked 2 of the boxes there for this Congress and the past Congress, because I wanted to use an example from last Congress, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. You'll see that in between, just out under Congress, it says legislation and law numbers. That is a space where if you actually know the number or the actual number for the piece of legislation that you're looking for, that's great, you can enter it there. But if not, and you just sort of know a phrase or you're trying to search around general issues, you can enter down at the bottom where I've entered a title, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and you can search there. So when you're ready, there's like a blue, just in the middle right hand side, there's a blue button that says search, and that will take you to your results. So the results for the Every Student Succeeds Act came up, and this is quite interesting, and I just wanted to point out a few things about it. So the first thing that actually came up is in the 115th Congress, which is in our current Congress right now. And you'll notice there's a red box above it that labels it as a bill. You'll also notice that below it is sort of a pathway to becoming law, and the gray shaded one shows that this has been introduced, but it hasn't progressed further. Except if you look at the latest action on this, you'll see that it says it was introduced in the House and then referred to the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. So as you saw in the previous illustration, when a bill gets introduced, it then goes forward for work within a particular committee, whatever committee is most relevant to the content of the bill. Below it, you'll see there's the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was actually passed into law last Congress, and so you can see at the top it's labeled law, and you can see that it's gone through all of the different stages of the process, and the dark shaded area is that it becomes law. You'll also see there that it has a committee label, and it shows the committee that was responsible for working with this legislation which was introduced in the Senate, and it was the Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, which is also known as the HELP Committee. And then you'll also notice that there is a committee report underneath, and so after both the House and the Senate have a chance to vote on a particular law, they'll have a conferencing period where they'll get together and discuss sort of ways to rectify issues that have come up or differences between the two before they send it to the president's desk. Okay, we can go from there. Thank you. All right, so the roles of the committees. So we've already talked about the fact that after a piece of legislation is introduced, the committee has the role of reviewing this legislation, making changes to the legislation, working with the legislation, but they also have non-legislative roles as well. And so these roles tend to fall under the category of oversight. This would be particularly related to things like nominations for cabinet members, for other big issues that might come up that you hear in the news, that when you hear that somebody is testifying before Congress, they're actually testifying before a particular committee from within the House or the Senate, or sometimes both. Also, they work with the budget. So for instance, when a particular branch of the government releases their budget, the head of that particular agency will come and testify before Congress regarding what they've proposed for that particular budget, and then the committees will have a chance to ask questions about that. In terms of the role of research, committees are a really great place for you to share your research and for your research to have an opportunity to have impact on the legislative process, but also on if there's a particular hearing coming up for a nomination for, say, the education secretary or something of that sort. Being able to share your research with someone on the committee means that is the way in which it is most likely to influence the questioning that will actually take place of that person during their hearing. Also, committee members together will often write letters, so giving them research about a particular issue or raising an issue and asking for a letter. The Senate committee might write one, the House committee might write one, or you might hear something called like the Big Four, which are the leadership from the parallel Senate and House committees. If there's a particular issue that you think or you want to advocate for there to be a hearing on, the committees make decisions about selecting what the topics for hearings should be, and also who the witnesses should be for the hearings. So that is another way in which speaking directly with committee members and sharing your research and work or your own expertise with them can help to influence that. And again, as mentioned, the committee members actually prepare the questions that are asked in these hearings and the statements and the debate that happen prior to votes on particular issues that come out of a committee, like in the case of a nomination of a cabinet member. Okay, we can advance, thanks. So here I've just included a list of the House committees so that you can see. Also, each of these is a hyperlink, so if you have access to the slides later, you can use them. The darker ones, you'll notice they say select committees. Sometimes Congress will form temporary committees to briefly address an issue, and so that's what you see there. They don't have an established website. And then the joint means that it has members in both the House and the Senate. Can advance, thanks. And then next you see the Senate committees here with somewhat similar. So if you were to be able to compare the two, you'd see the parallels. So I just wanted to take you to one of the websites. This is for the Help Committee, and you can just see, I want to just point out to you that they have a list of all the upcoming hearings as well as a calendar, so you can see the information there as well as how to access them. You'll also see across the top there will be similar information about hearings as well as committee actions around legislation or upcoming nominees that are being reviewed. I also selected an example from the Judiciary Committee because I thought this had two very interesting examples of upcoming hearings. The first is actually will be on Wednesday, and this is regarding the opioid crisis. And then the one at the bottom is what you've been hearing a lot about in the news, where Mark Zuckerberg will be testifying before Congress. So this will actually be a joint hearing with the Judiciary Committee and the Commerce Committee. But again, this is where you can see some of the big issues that a particular committee is tackling or addressing, and help you to identify the appropriate members to meet with and share research with as it's relevant to the issues that they're working closely with. I just wanted to give a little point out who the members of the committee are and how to navigate who to speak with. So in general, the committee membership will reflect the distribution of the majority and minority overall in the House and the Senate. So there will be people from both parties in a distribution that's similar to the way that they're more broadly distributed. The leader will always be from the majority party, and that person is called the chair, but the minority party will also always have their leader as well that is called the ranking member. And so here I have Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, the chair and the ranking member for the HELP committee in the Senate, and then Virginia Fox at the bottom, and Bobby Scott, the chair and ranking member for the House Education and Workforce Committee. There are also a wide range of subcommittees, and you can look into those and what members are on those subcommittees, because, for instance, with the HELP committee, they tackle a wide range of issues. So really looking to which people who are on specific subcommittees can help you to narrow the focus. So the last slide on this is just to reiterate some of the things above that we've talked about in terms of the unique positioning for committees and committee members, because they are so directly involved in particular legislative processes on certain issues, or have the power to make some decisions around sending nominees forward for votes in the overall in the Senate or the House. They are really focused on particular issues that relate to the committees that they're on. So if you, depending on what the issue is that you're working with and that you're interested in, finding someone who is on the relevant committee and speaking with them about it is really, should be your number one step. We would often get calls, because my senator was on the HELP committee, we often actually get calls from other members of staff asking us to co-sponsor legislation because they really wanted someone in the committee involved with a particular piece of legislation. And so that is a really, that should also help you to identify who. Basically, anyone who's on the committee will have the opportunity to speak in these committee contexts. Even though the chair and the ranking member are the leadership, everyone has a voice and a role. That said, those that are higher up in the committee will have specific staff designated for the committee, and then others will have personal staff. And so if you are looking for a committee issue, sometimes it's better to try to identify that member's staff that specifically works on their committee issues and try to meet with them. Finally, I just wanted to mention that there are also congressional caucuses, and that these vary in their degree of formality, and sometimes actually choosing to speak with somebody because they're on a caucus is a good idea, and it seems like a really appealing idea, but looking into the level of formality and recognition of that particular caucus is important. It does show if they're on a caucus that they do care about an issue, but their ability to make an impact on that issue is much stronger it's typically much stronger if they're on a committee versus a caucus. So thank you.
All right, this is Emily, and I'm going to pick things up here for the last section of our formal part of the presentation. And you know, as researchers or academics, we often hear about the importance of getting our research into the policy sphere and so forth. But it's really great to understand the different ways that research can be used in the policymaking process. It's not just like in the writing of a bill, which we often think about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then also talk about some of the challenges in using research. So next slide, please. So ideas for bills come from all kinds of places. They could come from very formal places like reports that are issued from private research firms. They can come from reputable news sources that have done their own investigative research, etc. It's not unusual for an elected member to actually start his or her day by scanning the newspapers and coming in with an idea and bringing this to a staffer and saying, we really need to do something about this. And then ideas also come from just meeting with constituents, and constituents can be individuals from one's home state or district. They can also be members from professional societies or advocates who come in to meet with legislators because of the positions that they hold on committees, etc., as Catherine was just talking about. But obviously, usually just a single report or an idea from a constituent or an article from a reputable news source is not enough to just immediately launch into legislation or into a bill. And so you really need, research is often used at this point to provide more evidence, to justify, to be able to expand our understanding of the problems that are being faced and really what are the potential solutions. Next slide, please. So research can also be used in terms of gaining support for a bill or legislation, and this can be done in a variety of different ways. This can be an instance where actually legislative staffers, who actually are the drivers and the movers of action on Capitol Hill, that legislative staffers actually share research and information between each other. Stakeholders can come from the community, or again, these professional groups who I mentioned, or advocates. They bring research into the process and bring it to the offices of elected officials to try to convince that legislation should be passed. They also may use this, the stakeholders may try to convince each other about why they should get on board. Another advocacy group should join in, another professional society should join in, so that there can be a larger collective mass behind an initiative. Staffers, I've also sat in on meetings where staffers also encourage stakeholders. So stakeholders will come to meet with staffers and they'll bring with them evidence. And staffers may say, you know, we're on board, but I understand that these three offices are sort of in a teetering place. They're not sure. So if you can bring this research to them, I think that they'll be open to hearing this idea. So that's another place and another way that research is used in the earlier process of bills. Next slide, please. And then it's just a similar story when actually, whoops, little too excited there. Okay, it's a similar story in terms of actually voting on the bill. So it's a lot of those same pathways, it's a lot of those same relationships that research can provide and answers about how to vote for a bill. Of course, there are a lot of other things that go into about how to vote for a bill. For example, what your colleagues, what the elected member's colleagues want him or her to do, what constituents want the elected member to do, the own values of the elected official, and certainly also what donors and financial supporters want the elected official to do. But research does enter into this place in the same way that I discussed more at the bill stage in the previous slide. Next slide, please. Passing legislation is actually just one way to influence operations of the federal government. Members of Congress can also send letters of support or of concern to executive branch offices to encourage them to act one way or another, to investigate problems, etc. And research can play a major role in providing justification for the action that the elected official is trying to get the executive branch to take. Next slide, please. Press releases. Press releases are used a lot as sort of consumers and just general members of the public. We often see these kinds of press releases, but you may not really understand until you're actually inside a congressional office or even at the state level, that might be true, how much press releases are used to make formal declarations out of a congressional office to the public, to one's constituents, to one's stakeholders. And so research is used in this way as well, that press releases are used to express concern, to announce support, etc., to announce a new bill, and that research is used in this process as well. Next slide, please. Research is used in responding to concerns that are expressed from constituents. And this could be, many of you may have written a letter at some time to one of your elected officials, and you may have received a response back, which sometimes it may have just been sort of a form letter. On occasion, you get letters back that are really responsive to your own individual concerns that were expressed. But regardless, research is often used in this way too, to justify the actions or inactions by elected members, and to sort of let constituents know where legislators stand on a particular issue and in terms of providing justification for that. Next slide. These next two slides are actually somewhat similar to each other. If we just sort of start at the top part of this slide, and just talking about the different timelines and paces of work that researchers and policymakers have. So at the very top of the first gray box, you know, Congress may see this window of opportunity, and I think that many of us thought that there was going to be this window of opportunity after something like the Sandy Hook shooting many years ago in Connecticut, and recently the shooting in Florida around action around gun control, or just in general around the regulation of firearms, that there was this window of opportunity and then bang, a policy is made. And that process can happen very, very rapidly. In the meantime, researchers are on a little bit of a different kind of timeline. They have to put a lot of time and effort into justifying and creating their research process so to make sure that it is rigorous so that the end result will be respected. Then data is collected and it is analyzed and presented, and then many of us go through this formal process of a peer review process that results in a publication, and then we bring this to Capitol Hill, hoping that actually the presentation of our research will create a window of opportunity. And in fact, that's not always the way it works, and that can lead to a lot of frustration on both parts there. And then at the bottom part of that, it's a similar kind of story, which is that, in fact, a lot of times Congress is receiving a tremendous amount of information from researchers, from advocates, from professional groups, from just a variety of stakeholders, from individuals who come forward and talk about how a particular piece of legislation has problems, et cetera, and how it is having a negative impact on their lives. And yet Congress does not take action. And it can be very frustrating for researchers to say, I just don't get this. I just don't understand. There's so much overwhelming evidence. Why is it that they won't take action? All right, next slide, please. And this is just sort of a similar thing as well, that there's this timeline that goes into research design and timelines around research and processes, et cetera, which can leave staffers and members of Congress feeling frustrated with the research process. And likewise, researchers may not understand part of the policymaking process. And you can, even if you just Google policymaking process, you'll get some kind of cycle that looks like this, of talking about around agenda setting and coming up with potential ideas, and then actually implementing those ideas and evaluating them. And then lo and behold, there's another problem. And so a great example from this is something that I learned when I was working on child welfare policy, is that child welfare policy rarely comes to the floor of the Senate for debate because it really just isn't considered a pressing enough issue. And so child welfare policy is almost exclusively passed by a move that's called by unanimous consent, which means that really everybody has to agree, or as little as one person can step forward and say that they disagree. And so not understanding that that's how something like child welfare policy gets passed can be confusing, disruptive, etc. Now you can go to the next slide, thanks. So another challenge to using research in terms of gaining bipartisan support is that even though staffers and researchers may try to convince the other side to sort of join them in the other side of the policy aisle to pass legislation, that they may be looking for different kinds of outcomes. So in sort of an example that is often used, they may pay attention to different types of sources or different types of outcomes. So some elected officials and their staffers may say, hoorah, welfare rolls are down, this is a sign of success. And other staffers and members of Congress may say, well, I'm not so much interested about welfare rolls or the numbers of people on welfare. We're really interested in whether or not fewer people are living in poverty. So they're really looking for different types of outcomes, etc. All right, the next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide in this section. And that sometimes research is actually just not there in order to provide justification for passing a particular type of legislation. Legislation may be consistent with the values of a particular office or an elected official, but in order to be able to provide justification and bring more people on board, it may actually not be there. One sort of example around this is that really the power of the federal dollar is really all that Congress has to offer in terms of trying to produce a particular type of outcome. And so a lot of it comes down to, will this particular action that is taken, will it save money or will it cost money? And so sometimes they really want to be able to say that such and such, they believe that that there is anecdotal evidence that will produce a savings to the federal government, but there may not be solid research there. I remember when we were trying to work on a particular issue in the office I was working on, I was only able to track down an academic at an office who didn't have peer-reviewed research yet, but was able to run some numbers for us and give us some answers over the phone. And the real question is that significant enough or solid enough to pass federal legislation? I would lean towards saying no, but so sometimes the information that a staffer or an office needs just isn't there, and that can provide a lot of frustration. And I believe that's the end of my slides there.
Wonderful, thanks, Emily. So we will dive right into questions. We had some pre-submitted, and then we've also gotten some great questions throughout the presentation. If you have additional questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box, and hopefully we can get through everyone's questions, but no guarantees. So we'll start with one that I'm going to have Emily and Catherine talk about a little bit, and that is, what is your biggest challenge and biggest success working with the federal government? So Emily, if you don't mind taking on what was one of the biggest challenges, and then Catherine can follow you with one of the biggest successes.
Well, I think that for me, one of the biggest challenges is that, I have a doctorate in public policy, and I really felt like it actually didn't prepare me for what I was doing in Congress. That Congress is so enormous and so procedural, and even spending a year's time on the Hill is just the briefest of windows into this thing that we call the federal government, and how you want everything to be based in research, and everything isn't based in research. But it's about figuring out sort of the nuances around when you bring research in. We talk about this critical window for policymaking, but there is a critical window for when research can come in and be useful. And really figuring out that time frame can be challenging and frustrating.
Thanks, Emily. So one of the things that actually was successful, and I will just share something that was quite exciting about the opportunity to work with the federal government, was this opportunity to actually help to write pieces of legislation. As Emily mentioned, things do move quite slowly, so I want to qualify when I say actually write and introduce a piece of legislation. It doesn't mean that it actually is a law now, but that it's at least on the books. And when something like that happens, I'll just tell you a quick story. I had taken a lot of my research is in the area of teacher education, and I had the opportunity to help introduce a piece of legislation on teacher education while I was there. And recently, a friend of mine who's now working in the House side was doing a quick search of teacher education legislation and contacted me and said, hey, did you have anything to do with this? Because this piece of legislation really aligns with the research that's out there and everything that I'd like to see. And it did happen to be that. And so having that opportunity to be there and be able to help shape the legislation, which does in turn help shape conversations, is, I think, one of the ways in which you can feel quite successful with working with the federal government.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is, what are suggestions for graduate students that are doing this work? This was a really popular question, and Rashmi's going to take this one.
Okay, there are a few things you can do. The first thing you can do is try to look out for opportunities within your university itself that can put you in touch with policymakers. So I had two such opportunities. There was one project that was focused on child victimization, and here I had an opportunity to figure out how can research inform the work of state level legislators. And there was a second project that I was working on that was run by another faculty member who was looking at immigration issues in the city where the university was based. And she was working with local level legislators. So those were a couple of opportunities that I got from my university itself to engage with policymakers. So I would really say look out for such opportunities. So you have a sense of how this world can function. The second thing I would say is look out for fellowships. The AAAS fellowship is, of course, a much longer one, and you have to finish your graduate studies for that. But there are other ones. One that immediately comes to mind is a fellowship called Dalmas-Taylor Fellowship, and this is given out by SPICY, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. And so these shorter fellowships, and this is for like 2 or 3 months, and they give you exposure to engaging with federal level policymakers. So that's another way of doing it. A third way of doing it could be, at one point in time, at least before the 2016 elections, there were not as many people who would have liked to run for office. And now there are some districts where they say it's raining candidates. So since that's happening, I would really say, see if there are any candidates that you like. And one way to take your research into public policy might be to support those candidates and bring your research to them and support their campaign. And what you can also do, of course, is attend conferences that have a policy component. SPICY is one such conference. Finally, what I would like to add is there is one thing that is not useful as researchers. Of course, you can always get in touch with your members of Congress, and that's always useful to get to know how that process can look like. But what's not useful for the office is when we take white papers, and researchers tend to do that a lot. We tend to write these 2-pagers or 3-pagers. And unfortunately, during my time there, I've spoken with a lot of staffers, people don't have the time to read that. So that's probably not a very effective way of doing things.
Thanks, Rashmi. Another question is it appropriate to talk to a committee member, even if you're not a constituent? So Emily and Catherine, why don't you take that one?
Okay, this is Emily. So those are pretty much the only types of meetings that I took while I was working on the Hill in the Senate. I was working for the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Ron Wyden was ranking member. And as Catherine walked you through, ranking member means the highest level of authority that you can get on a committee while you're in the minority. So, and then on the flip side, it would be the chair for the majority party. So we took meetings all the time from people who were not from Senator Wyden's state of Oregon. They were coming to meet with me and the staffer who I was working with specifically because of Senator Wyden's position as a ranking member. And these meetings were primarily with advocacy groups and professional societies, all professional societies, well, I don't want to say all, I'll say most professional societies have a staff person who is assigned, it's called something like a government relations, etc. And then on occasion, we also did meet with researchers who were just coming on their own, who were doing really interesting, groundbreaking stuff. That was the purpose of our meetings, was just because of Senator Wyden's influence in the Senate Finance Committee.
So thanks, Emily. And as I mentioned when we were talking about it, sometimes if a member is not a ranking member or the chair, they'll have kind of a mix of staff, maybe 1 or 2 staff that are for a specific committee member that they're have a little bit more seniority on. And so the first thing you would want to do if you want to talk to someone on a committee is find out whether there is a designated committee staff member for a particular issue, and if not, it is still okay to meet with someone in their personal office. But it would be important because you are coming in and you aren't a constituent, which is totally allowed. But in order to frame what you're speaking about, it would be important to say that one of the reasons that you wanted to have this appointment and speak with this member was because of their position on this particular committee, and then proceed from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily and Catherine. The next question is, are there any workshops for learning how to communicate with and write for policymakers? And Rashmi, this piggybacks a little off of the question you just answered. So if you want to take this one, that'd be great.
Yeah, I was talking about SPICY's workshop. So SPICY, which stands for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, they hold a one-day workshop before their annual conference, and that is really excellent for figuring out how to communicate with policymakers. They teach you how to write a policy brief, and that's like a one-page policy brief. Again, many staffers don't think these long white papers are useful, but something like a one-page policy brief might actually be much more, it's much more likely to be read. The second thing you can do, I think SRCD also organizes these workshops. So that's something you can look up. And finally, there's an organization called COSA, Consortium of Social Sciences Association. And they also organize events on the Hill. So that's another place where you can look for, they might be organizing these workshops.
Great, and I'm also going to add, there's a network called the Scholars Strategy Network, and that is a group of academics that the group that leads it is a separate staff, but they organize workshops like this. So it might be worth looking to see if you have a regional scholar strategy network in your state that you could get in touch with, and not even, you don't even, I think, have to become a member to attend their workshops that offer some of this information. The next question is, any perspectives on doing this at the state level, and how might it be different or similar? And I'm going to take this one. I think this could be an entirely separate webinar to talk about doing this at the state level, because there are lots of differences. There are definitely similarities in terms of the structure at the state level mirrors the structure at the federal level. So in most states, well, in all states, there's an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And within the legislative branch, there are two chambers, either the House, or it could also be called the Assembly, and the Senate, that are working to write legislation through the committee process. However, there are lots of differences across states. So the first thing I would suggest of doing this at the state level is to learn about how your state legislature operates. Some states have full-time legislatures, which means they have lots of staff. They're there most of the year, and they spend less time back at their districts and might not have full-time jobs outside of being legislators because they're doing that full-time. Working with those legislators will be very different than working in states where there's a part-time legislature. Those legislators, often called citizens legislatures, those legislators often have outside jobs that they take when the legislature is not in session, and they're in session for a much shorter period of time. I think the shortest one is Texas, where they actually only meet every other year. So knowing the timeline that that legislature is on is a key part of knowing how much you can be of service to those legislators, and then also knowing how many staff they have. In legislatures where they have lots of staff, those staff may be helping them do lots of research and outreach to try and find experts they can use to help support what they're working on. In states where they have smaller staff, those legislators may be more open to working directly with researchers because they simply don't have the staff capacity to do that for them, and they're doing a lot of it on their own and just might not have time and be more open to using your resources. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. And I think one thing that we can all talk a little bit about is when meeting with a staffer or a legislator themselves, what are some of the key things that can make that conversation successful? Does anybody want to take that one?
I can start. Oh,
Okay.
I just actually wanted to frame this a little bit in what Emily said, so then I can pass it right over to you, Emily. But I think that Emily's illustration was quite key in terms of answering this question about the window of opportunity. And while it is important to continue to educate members of Congress about really critical issues, being able to present research that is when a window of opportunity opens really is a time where we have seen some success. And so, and I just want to also make an important point that it's not necessarily always success shouldn't always be measured by a piece of legislation getting passed, but sometimes actually blocking a piece of legislation from getting passed can also be seen as a success. And I think we've seen some examples of that with regard to healthcare and in terms of a recent example where there has been a big window where people have come in and shared research that and educated their members about some of the detriments of a piece of legislation passing, and then it hasn't. Emily, you can continue if you want.
Yeah, I think I'd just add on to that, that the way that you present information is really helpful. Congress is very old school. Congress deals a lot with paper, believe it or not. They and the business card is very important in Congress. So you want to leave the member with something, and things like an infographic is particularly helpful. You really want to be able to summarize what you need to say in one pager. And make sure that it is in language that could be understood really by anybody you would pull out of Capitol Hill. So I think sort of the simplicity of the ability to take complex information and distill it down into a simple message is extremely important. So I think we're close to time, so I'll leave it at that.
Yep, thank you all so much. I'm going to pass it back to Patricia. I think she had some closing remarks from SRCD.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today, especially thank you so much to our speakers for such a thought-provoking presentation. If you liked today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. The next consortium webinar will be on May 3rd, and the topic will be Coding as a Developmental Playground, Computational Thinking and Robotics in Early Childhood. You can see more information on this slide, and registration is available on the consortium website and the consortium listserv. You can, if you're not already a member, you can join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, a quarterly newsletter, as well as other job and event announcements. And I will send around a follow-up email that will include a copy of today's slides and a link to today's webinar, which was recorded and will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.